the late 60s and into the 1970s was largely sort of fringy because it was a very new application of old technology. And there was the notion of, do gravitational waves exist or not? And if they do, are they even detectable here on Earth? But as we see going through the 80s, there was a big battle in terms of a lot of astronomers did not want LIGO funded because they didn't want to lose funding. So one of the justifications was to say that the science isn't there yet, and therefore we shouldn't take the risk. But as you can see, when we move into the mid-1990s through the 2000s, it becomes an idea that with the right instrumentation, of course, gravitational waves exist, and laser interferometry is a way to do it.
Welcome to My Nuclear Life. I'm Shelley Lesher. Since starting this podcast, it has been fun to discover new ways that nuclear science has impacted the world. Sometimes I run across things that I didn't expect. That is true of today's episode, where nuclear science had an impact on another seemingly unrelated branch of science, gravitational wave physics. Yes, even LIGO, whose stated mission is to, quote, seek and detect gravitational waves and use them for the exploration of fundamental science, has benefited from the nuclear weapons complex. To tell us all about it is Tiffany Nichols. She's a doctoral candidate in the Department of the History of Science at Harvard University, a graduate student affiliate at the Black Hole Initiative, and a National Science Foundation grantee. Her research focuses on how place, surrounding environment, and laboratory are embedded in the output signals of the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, or LIGO. Tiffany brings a unique perspective to this work and to our conversation. The breadth and depth of her knowledge and experience is, well, impressive. She started her education at the University of Virginia, earning a BS in electrical engineering and a Juris Doctor. Previous positions include the Rand Corporation, University of California, Berkeley Law School, and highly ranked U.S. law firms where she focused on intellectual property litigation and patent prosecution. Before we start, I wanted to give you a timeline of the LIGO project. Scientific projects can move slow, especially when we're dealing with one as large as LIGO. Keep in mind, this is a very condensed version of the story, and Tiffany will give us some references for books that you can read that explains the history in much more detail. Basically, the story begins around 1968 when Kip Thorne begins the theoretical efforts behind the gravitational wave experiments. In the 1970s and 1980s, Rainer Weiss and his colleagues performed a series of experiments to assess the feasibility of this sort of project, finding a type of experiment that would work, and they finally settled on an interferometer. After this initial activity, the LIGO project languishes in governmental approvals and a lot of internal politics until 1994, when Barry Barish was appointed laboratory director. He reimagined the project plan and restructured the budget. The project was finally approved and funded for $395 million, which is equivalent to over $711 million in today's money. Construction started immediately. The Hanford, Washington site broke ground in 1994, and the Livingston, Louisiana site broke ground in 1995. First light, which is when the interferometers were turned on and ready to take data, happened in the summer of 2002. It took another 13 years and a $200 million upgrade to detect the first gravitational wave in 2015. For this detection, Rainer Weiss, Barry Barish, and Kip Thorne were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 2017. Keep in mind, only 3 people can share the Nobel Prize. The paper announcing the detection of gravitational waves has around 2,300 authors. So there is a much larger contribution to the science than just those who win the Nobel Prize. What interests me about your work is I know a lot about LIGO now after we've heard about the discovery of gravitational waves, but your work concentrates on the beginning of LIGO. So could you start by telling us what LIGO is, what it stands for, and when it was first proposed?
Yes, these are great questions. So LIGO stands for the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, which is a mouthful, but it tells us exactly what it does. So it uses laser interferometry to detect gravitational waves. And it does that by utilizing the properties of light and the speed of light to detect deformations in space-time caused by gravitational waves. So LIGO is actually prefaced by a different method that was developed in the 1950s and 60s by Joseph Weber, which is the resonant bar method. They use big resonant bars that are probably the size of a dinner table in length, and then as wide as the spread of your arm width. And the idea was when a gravitational wave would hit at certain frequencies, it would resonate, and these signals could then be amplified and recorded on a computer, for example. It turns out those were not sensitive enough, although there was a detection announced. So in the late 60s, detection was announced and it was debunked. But at that time, people have been thinking about other methods of doing gravitational wave detection because they couldn't really verify the results that were coming out of the bar detectors, or they couldn't calibrate the bar detectors, or they couldn't make them sensitive enough. And one of those methods was laser interferometry. So Ray Weiss came up with the idea by exploring a homework problem in one of his general relativity classes that he was teaching at MIT in the late 60s. And around the same time, Robert Forward at Hughes Aircraft was also exploring the same technology. And so this was in the early 70s. So around the same time, physicists are thinking about similar ways of detecting gravitational waves.
What's so exciting about gravitational waves?
I feel like you should ask a gravitational wave physicist, but from a perspective of a historian of physics, this is new and fundamental physics that's being done. New ways of doing physics, because as you can see, there's a bit of an argument, is gravitational wave physics, astrophysics, or astronomy. Now we have this concept of multi-messenger astronomy, because one of the cool things about gravitational waves is they can come through and be detected and then signal to other forms of detection like X-rays, light. We had this with the neutron star merger, and there can be follow-on detections that happen in other areas of the spectrum. So that's pretty cool. It also gives us information about, hey, black holes actually do exist and we can directly detect them, whereas before they had been indirectly detected. And we learn more about, for example, where certain elements on our periodic table come from. And that's what happened with the neutron star merger. So we're learning about the behavior of black holes in terms of spin, size, in terms of mass, and all of this is coming out of gravitational wave signals.
Wow, that's a big impact for one discovery, but that discovery was a really long time coming, right? You said they were working on this since the 50s or 60s, but then LIGO starts coming about in the 70s. So this is a very long-term project. How do you get something like that funded?
Serendipity, hard work. So one of the things that I've been very beneficial and having the opportunity to do is talk with individuals who are very pivotal in this process, such as Kip Thorne and Rainer Weiss. And so they're physicists who had the idea. So Kip Thorne had the theoretical support, Ray Weiss had the instrumental design, and together they were able to build a case along with Ronald Drever. But also we have people like Richard Isaacson, who was at the time the program manager who was over gravitation at NSF. He had some background in gravitational wave detection. He knew the science, which is always the case at the NSF when it comes to program managers or have unique understanding of the research that they're managing. And he had the foresight to see long term that this can have potential wide impact, and having the savvy to convince the higher ups in the NSF and thinking through how to convince Congress to fund such a large project. But also you can see Ray Weiss and Kip Thorne also had similar views to see the future or predict the future in a sense, but in the areas of theory and experimentation.
So is this a well-established idea at the time, or is there a little controversy over funding such a large project and kind of the physics that was being explored?
This is a good question. It actually goes way back to Einstein. So when he's developing the general theory of relativity, he wasn't quite certain that gravitational waves existed, and he went back and forth a couple of times. He thought it might be a residual artifact of the coordinate system that was chosen. And then he said, even if they were detected, we would never have an instrument sensitive enough, because at the time he predicted that a gravitational wave stream would be on the scale of 10 to the negative 25. And at the time, the most precise measurement was the Michelson and Morley experiment, which was 10 to the negative 13. And this went through for a long time because a war was closing, and then the Second World War was happening. Then we have the Cold War. And a lot of focus in physics was on other areas that had application to the military. So general relativity kind of got pushed back. And this idea of, do gravitational waves actually exist? That was still a question. By the 1950s, we're starting to see, yes, gravitational waves likely exist as well as black holes. And they are likely detectable. But a lot of people were still uncertain, particularly astronomers, those who were not knee-deep in what would become gravitational wave physics. And then we have Joseph Weber come along, and the resonant bars did push the field forward in terms of experimentation, but they left a lot of doubt for those who weren't in gravitational wave physics. So I would posit laser interferometry by the late 60s into the 1970s was largely sort of fringy because it was a very new application of an old technology. And there was the notion of, do gravitational waves exist or not? And if they do, are they even detectable here on Earth? But as we see going through the 80s, I would still say still on the fringes. There was a big battle in terms of a lot of astronomers did not want LIGO funded because they didn't want to lose funding. So one of the justifications was to say that the science isn't there yet, and therefore we shouldn't take the risk. But as you can see, when we move into the mid-1990s through the 2000s, it becomes an idea that with the right instrumentation, of course, gravitational waves exist, and laser interferometry is the way to do it.
Well, tell me what your approach is. Tell me what it is that you're doing in the history of science and how it differs from people who have looked at this in the past.
Oh, yeah. So there are many wonderful books on the history of LIGO. And one of them that I want to point out is Einstein's Symphony by Marisa Bartusiak. So she provides this large history that I just provided. And then also Harry Collins and his Gravity's Shadow series. There are quite a few number of books, and everyone should read all of them. He takes a sociology of science method and thinking about how do you get people on board to a theory and invest in a theory such that it should be funded and build experimentation. Like, how does that whole process work to convince people that this is the way to go? So those are several books, my two scholars on this topic. My work is looking more at LIGO instruments are very large, and they have to be very large to make them sensitive. So they cover lots of land. And I'm interested in how land becomes entangled in the output signals of LIGO. Another way of saying that is I posit that LIGO needs to have a detailed and minute understanding of its environment in the instrument and in the environment where the instrument is housed in order to make generalized understandings of the universe. Questions that we have now is, how do you put something so large that needs to be so sensitive in the right spot? And then once you have a spot, because you can't really control the environment to a T, how do you design an instrument that will compensate for some of the aspects that may mask or hide the gravitational wave signal that you're trying to detect?
That sounds difficult when you put it that way. First of all, when you say it's big, how big is it?
Oh, so
Like a mile? Is it a couple blocks? Like,
Yeah, it's bigger than that. So
It's bigger than a mile?
Yeah, so there are two interferometers, one in
Okay.
Hanford, Washington, and one in Livingston, Louisiana. They're L-shaped, and each arm is 2.5 miles long. So a size
What?
of a small city, or a small town, should we
Whoa.
say. Yeah.
2.5 miles. So there's two arms, they're in an L, and each one is 2.5 miles.
Yes, and the cool thing is when you go to the site, you can't actually see how long it is, but because when you look across the arm, you can see the earth curving, like, which is quite phenomenal. I don't really know any other spot on earth where we have that visual reference where we can see that the earth is curved.
Okay, so that would really impact where you put it.
Yes.
So I imagine one of the things that, I mean, from what I know about an interferometer, I mean, you have to have a flat piece of land, right? I mean, you can't put it in a mountain.
Yes, because light is going to go in a straight line. It doesn't care about the curvature of the earth. So they looked for flat land or continually sloping at the same angle. So flat on an incline.
So who was in charge of the site selection? Like, did they have the approval to build and then they started looking at sites? Or did people say, like, well, just in case this gets funded, let's start thinking about where we're going to put it? Like, and did the timing hold significance? Like, how did this work?
I would say it was very complicated and it happened in many phases. So early on, around the early 80s, Ray Weiss knew large-scale interferometry has extreme potential to detect gravitational waves. And at that time, he was thinking on the scale of, and I'm going to switch to metric units now.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
that makes way more sense to me too. Okay, so
Yeah, okay, cool. So he thought the arms, instead of 4 kilometers, which they are now, he was thinking 5 kilometers to 10 kilometers. And so you could see the land requirements were even greater. NSF funded a feasibility study to go see if we can, and when I say we, I mean physicists involved in this endeavor, can even site something this large with this arrangement in the United States. And so there were quite a few sites that came up. Most of them were military sites, because the idea is one of the other requirements for this very large instrument is we want as little seismic noise as possible. So the site should be still as possible. And so the idea is military sites often have restricted access, so therefore human activity is lower, but I interrogate those assumptions in my dissertation. And so most of the sites are military sites. A lot of sites are land held by the Bureau of Land Management, and a lot of sites are in very remote and distant areas beyond that. So there was that phase. Then this was mostly driven by Ray Weiss, but also Kip Thorne. So Ray Weiss looked at mostly East Coast sites, but some West Coast sites. Kip Thorne considered some West Coast sites. And they started traveling and assessing the sites from an experimentalist perspective, but also how the interferometers are arranged, because gravitational waves are polarized. They wanted 2 sites that are 1,500 kilometers apart to allow for the detection of a polarized gravitational wave. But also, if there was local seismic noise, it would be easier to discern a gravitational wave if it passed through both sites, because they would know that that aberration was likely attributed to a gravitational wave and not local noise. So that was part of it. So they're assessing these sites. But at the same time, we see a lot of scrutiny coming into physics funding, because for a long time there was a relationship between physics funding and the military, and that was starting to dissipate, and this project is starting to get very expensive. So they settled on some sites, but the NSF said, we really need to do this on a national scale to make sure we're selecting the sites that are the best possible sites for detecting gravitational waves. So then there was a national site selection solicitation that brought in many site candidates, and a lot of them were the ones that the team of physicists originally had identified. But then you have to realize LIGO is an ongoing site now in terms of operation. So not only does it have to be scientifically sound, the local community and the state where it's housed have to support the ongoing experiment. So there has to be synergy between those factors. And that's how we ultimately got a site. So there was not one person in charge, but there was scientific assessment by the physicists and experts. There was outside oversight. There was internal oversight by the NSF, and there was input from Congress and local state officials. And then also, when we have big pieces of land, we have lots of landowners, so they had a say too.
And they had to find 2 sites.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Going through all of that, it seems practically impossible to find 2 sites that matched all of this criteria. It sounds impossible to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I can't believe they actually found 2.
Yeah, it makes a very exciting history because I will say I'm very impressed by what Ray Wise, his team did, what Kip Thorne, his team did, and looking at the sites and the various things they encountered while assessing sites. But ultimately, they did find it. And I would say it's a little bit of serendipity because when it came down to it, Hanford was not originally proposed in the early phase. It came in during the national level site selection. And when we think about it, Hanford is a nuclear waste repository. So therefore, population density is technically 0 in terms of people who continuously live on the land. And when you're storing nuclear waste, it has to be seismically still and quiet. And also, some of the land features that were appealing to the Manhattan Project also map on to land features that are now appealing to LIGO. So once you set that site in Washington and you have to get 1,500 kilometers away, it does wipe out a lot of the sites on the West Coast, narrowing the decision down. And we ended up with Livingston, Louisiana.
So let's talk about the Hanford site, because that, I think, was the most surprising part to me, is how the requirements for LIGO kind of mapped onto the requirements that you need for nuclear waste. Was there an issue with finding the sites for LIGO and the competition for the nuclear waste sites? Like, did they overlap often?
Not necessarily. You can sense the I'm thinking in the tone of my voice. So the LIGO site in Hanford is not quite behind the gate access that you have to go to get onto the DOE site. So I think that helps. I encourage everyone to go to the Hanford site. The B reactor tour is very interesting. The vitrification facility is interesting. Concepts of land and nature and how nature is actually sort of preserved on nuclear reservation sites, because we have to keep everything still and disruption free, is interesting.
I didn't realize that. I didn't realize that you had to keep land preserved and disruption free on Hanford.
Yeah, because you don't want to disturb the waste, and I'm saying this in very simplistic terms, but I will also say one of the strange things for me is, what does a nuclear waste site sound like? Because when I first came and I did the historic Hanford tour, for example, I don't think I've ever been somewhere that quiet. And the lack of noise is a noise. So that's interesting. But also, because it's disruption free, it was probably one of the most beautiful reservation sites I've seen, which is ironic. It's aesthetically just really interesting to see. And yeah, it's a beautiful site. It's also interesting to see some of the newer facilities on how we're thinking through dealing with nuclear waste products.
And so that's all inside the fence, but outside the fence is LIGO. And can you take a tour of LIGO?
Yes. Well, right now it's not open because of the pandemic, unfortunately, but LIGO is very publicly facing. So each site usually has Science Saturdays. You can go on the site and get a tour of the facility, get a background of the physics that goes into it, meet a lot of the people who work in the facility. So the people who are named on papers are there talking to students, hobbyists, people who are just interested. Both sites are very open. It's very remote though, because when you're traveling to either of them, You do wonder whether you got lost, but that's a sign they put it in the right spot, right?
Right. So because it's it's outside of the fence at Hanford, then they didn't have to worry about digging up any waste or any concerns about that. They also must have been concerned about site access when they were looking at military sites. So I know when you're dealing with military sites or DOE sites, there's always issues with trying to bring in non-US citizens. And the scientific community is very international. So was that a problem that they came up against?
Yeah, so one of the sites that they were really, really interested in was the Edwards Air Force Base site. And you can see why this is also ideal. It's not far a drive from Pasadena, where Caltech is. So LIGO is operated by Caltech with a partnership with MIT. And so for that site, the history is sort of interesting because, as I said earlier, for much of the 20th century, physicists had a close relationship with the military-industrial complex. So depending on what area of physics you were in, perhaps getting clearance or access was not a big deal. LIGO brought in Stone and Webster, which had worked on some Manhattan Project sites to do the initial suggestions of sites. So I posit that perhaps they didn't consider access to be a big deal because they had access so often. And we have to remember general relativity was on the fringes. So a lot of the scientists may not have had all these various clearances because there weren't military applications really until GPS much later. And so when LIGO started approaching a site like Edwards, it did so through JPL and NASA. But LIGO has always been an international collaboration. And one of the reasons is general relativity has always been a very international subfield of physics. So it was unheard of to have not work with your international colleagues. So Edwards Air Force Base develops a lot of equipment and aircraft that we don't necessarily want designed to go out. So the security on that base is particularly high. So you could see there was a bit of a conflict at the time with giving access to international individuals. And on top of that, this was during the waning years of the Cold War. So the Cold War mentality was still there on the military side. So certain countries behind the Iron Curtain were actually given incredible scrutiny to the point where there was no, we are not giving access to individuals from these countries. But that is very much mapped on to the Cold War politics of the time.
Was that the deal breaker for the Edwards Air Force Base site, the access?
Not necessarily. It gave more scrutiny to the site. Kip Thorne is very interesting because he's known as working a lot with Brzezinski on theories of general relativity. Brzezinski was from the Soviet Union at the time. So it was just unheard of. So he came up with creative ways of dealing with this. And I think because general relativity wasn't so used to working with the military, he came in with new ideas and didn't assume that security was just barred. He was ready for a negotiation. So the LIGO site would have been at the edge of the military base, near the JPL facility. So there were already civilians coming on base already, was his mentality. Why not, as long as we stay over there, let people on? But I think this is very exciting in terms of history of physics, because for so long, particularly with the McCarthyism, physicists were very careful to make sure they can maintain their ability to get security clearance or maintain their security clearance. And then we have general relativists coming in who hadn't really had to deal with that, thinking about new ways of thinking about security and access. So they just put in more work.
That's very interesting because you're right. Coming from a nuclear background, generations of my kind have had that worry and have been dealing with security clearances for a very long time. So it's hard for me to imagine a place where I would have never thought about security clearances, like the general relativists.
Or even questioning, why is this security clearance a thing? Let's figure out the boundaries so that we can come up with a solution. It's a very different mentality.
If that wasn't the deal breaker for the Edwards Air Force Base, what was? How was LIGO then not positioned at Edwards Air Force Base?
Well, I will say Eastern Washington is very pretty, and it was in the line of totality, or almost, when we had the eclipse in 2017. So, but yeah, on the Edwards Air Force Base, they had to face a couple additional problems. So it was assumed that you didn't have to deal with endangered species. It turns out you do on military bases. They still care about the environment. Also, the Air Force had to relent its land to other projects, and so was very concerned about portions of the base being consumed by basic science. So started asserting some power, such as if the mission of the base changes such that we cannot have people on the base, we are allowed to eject you within 90 days. So by 1992, to construct LIGO was about $300 million. So could you imagine your landlord saying, my mission has changed on this land. You need to remove your $300 million instrument within 90 days. I'll see you. So that factored in. The other thing that happened is the national phase of site selection happened. So many new candidates came in, such as Hanford. And with the shakedown, it was Hanford. So that precluded Edwards from being chosen because it was too close.
I can't believe... Okay, the eviction notice part, or the eviction clause, I think would be a very big deal breaker. I don't even know what they could have finished up in 90 days. I mean, I don't even know that they could have finished the science they were doing in 90 days, let alone break anything down. That's insane.
But if you think about LIGO right now, so each arm is on a flat, absolutely flat concrete slab, and the instrumentation is housed in a big concrete domes. Like, could you imagine having to disassemble that? And the instrumentation is under, I think it's still the longest vacuum system in the world, or one of the longest. Like, could you imagine having to disassemble all of that within a 3-month period?
So the instrument's under vacuum?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I didn't realize that part.
Yeah. So that's one of the problems that LIGO had to solve. How do you build a super huge vacuum system? But that's a sidebar.
I mean, all I'm thinking of is how long did it take to reach vacuum?
Oh, yeah.
Did the ending of the Cold War impact the site selection process? Did different sites open up to them at that point?
Oh, well, I think, Hanford, when it proposed itself, or how should I say this? In Plutopia, Kate Brown talks about the dependence that the local area has on the nuclear industry at Hanford. And this is largely because Richland grew up with and alongside the Manhattan Project. And so if we're shutting down reactors and cocooning them, a lot of them are cocooned now, so that they're not releasing radiation or reducing the amount of radiation that's emanating, we can see that the industry is changing. So it has to change over from producing these materials, our energy, to how to store highly dangerous material. And when we think about sort of the PR around that, one could see that there are many different options that one can take to maintain the industry that was largely dependent on the Manhattan Project. So that's kind of timed with the winding down of the Cold War, and some of the weapons and technologies that were needed with that were also timed with siting a place of basic science near the Hanford site.
How many permanent scientists are at one of the sites? Do you know?
Don't quote me on this. I think it's about 40. This is based on me visiting the site. But I will say, with the LIGO Scientific Collaboration, so that's the scientific collaboration that supports the work of LIGO and does work through the LIGO observatories in Hanford and Livingston, they're rotating through. Graduate students are getting trained on how to use the instruments, getting to test new improvements once they're ready to be tested on the larger site. Also thinking about ways of reducing noise and analyzing data. So I think the base community is about 40 people on each site. But we have to remember larger collaboration is rotating through these sites on a continual basis.
Yes, I'm thinking of it as a comparison to, say, CERN, where the permanent faculty, like the permanent residence there, is probably similar. It's not very large, but the collaboration is massive, and there are a lot of visitors coming in and out at different periods of time. But as far as like employees of CERN, it's very small for what you would expect.
And I just looked it up, about 40.
Oh, good job.
Yeah. Okay.
So looking forward, is LIGO looking to expand? Like they must be looking for something bigger and better. Is there new technology out there? Are there going to be new bases or?
So the 2 LIGO sites have already been upgraded, and that happened. The upgrades finished in 2015. There are upgrades going on right now. I think they're leveraging the downtime due to the pandemic. They're projecting that we're going to get even more detections because right now we have 50. And they're adding to the network. There is a project to place an interferometer in India. A site has already been selected, and they're working through the international collaboration tasks to get everything going and off the ground. There is also Kagra in Japan. So that is hoping to join the collaboration soon. It's been a little delayed, but everything's built. And it's just my understanding and calibration issue are getting the sensitivity to the right level. And the next phase is Einstein telescope, which is actually, I think, 6 interferometers and a triangular arrangement that's underground that's going to be somewhere in Europe. There's also LISA, which will be out in space that can detect gravitational waves at lower frequencies that we can't do on here on Earth because of limitations with noise and seismic disturbances. But we also have Cosmic Explorer, which is projected to have arms at 20 kilometers to 40 kilometers.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is that in space or on Earth?
That will be on Earth. I think there will be a site in the US, and I've heard that there might be one in Australia.
How are they going to find a site in the US for that?
Well, it turns out they already have found sites from that initial site selection phase. If you talk to any gravitational wave physicists in Europe, they'll always make the statement, oh, the US has abundance of land. They're fine. It turns out it's harder to find a site than that. But there are areas like the Great Salt Lake area, Bonneville Flats. So you cannot be close to an airport per se, but there is a lot of land that is very flat in the United States, just as there is in Australia and other places with similar geography.
Is it just as important to have it be as quiet now, or has technology improved that you don't have to worry so much about that kind of quote quietness?
That's a good question. When I asked LIGO physicists this, they had to develop a lot of technologies once they got the sites to bring them to the level of sensitivity that was needed to detect gravitational waves. So there has been an abundance of innovation that's happened. And arguably, and I hope LIGO people aren't quite upset when I say this, but I think they're now at a phase where, depending on the length and where the site is, they have more freedom on where they can place the interferometers in terms of noise, which is, I think, very, very cool. And in terms of a control theory problem, that's pretty phenomenal. Our control theory and precision measurement. Yeah.
That is pretty cool. What is the most kind of interesting or surprising thing that you found when researching this topic for your thesis?
That's a tough question. I guess what was most surprising to me is more of a personal people issue. LIGO has been awarded 3 Nobel Prizes, and there has not been a LIGO person who is not willing to talk about their work. Everyone is so open and so excited about their work, and very excited to the extent that you get very excited. It's very infectious. And I found that very surprising because I wasn't expecting that. We have stereotypes about what physicists do. We have Einstein sitting in a chair in a solo room, but all the individuals at LIGO are constantly doing different things and very busy, but also very open to talking about their work. And this is why Science Saturday is cool if you can make it down to the site. They have actual gravitational wave physicists and engineers leading the tours and asking all the questions you may have about the instrumentation and what they do. And they're always just very excited to share a part of their daily research and lives. So that to me was very, very, very surprising and exciting.
So what's next? What's next for this topic, or what's next for you?
Finishing up the dissertation, which will hopefully turn into a book.
Yes.
One of the sites...
Yes, yeah. Turn it into a book.
And one of the sites that I would like to pick up along the way is the site in Japan, because it's in a mine, which there's no other site like this right now in terms of the interferometer network that has this geographic landscape. So I think that would be very interesting to add. Yeah.
And not just because you want to go to Japan?
Let's just say gravitational wave physicists found really cool places to place sites. So there's one in Hannover, Germany, which I've been to and I recommend going. Hanover is a very friendly city, and it's not too far from Hamburg and Berlin. But also the Virgo site in Italy is right outside of Pisa. So if there's any tourism efforts and you wanted to do tourism around gravitational wave detectors, I think you would be making good choices.
I mean, here's an offshoot for your book, just saying. You could do a gravitational wave tour guide.
Oh, I like that.
And you can write a book around, you could be a gravitational wave tourist.
Oh, I love that.
That's your second book.
Yeah, and that sort of has a nice parallel intersection with sort of the disaster tourists who go to sites like Chernobyl and Hanford.
Thank you for listening to another episode of My Nuclear Life, and thank you to Tiffany Nichols for a fun conversation. To learn more about the podcast or send us an email, head over to our website, mynuclearlife.com. To support us, leave a review wherever you are listening to this podcast and tell a friend to listen to. If you are interested, head over to patreon.com, where we will post extended conversations with our guests. The link is in the show notes and on our webpage. I'm Shelley Lesher, and this has been My Nuclear Life.